In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the 1950s, otherwise known as the Nifty Fifties, and we'll be on page 2 of your interactive notebook. Before we get into the actual 1950s, let's talk about what the end of the 40s looked like, especially with the end of World War II. So after the fall of Japan in 1945, the world had to kind of come back together and put ourselves back together. So we're going to divide up Europe to see what it looked like after World War II. The Western nations of Europe, the Allied armies came in, liberated all of those nations conquered by Germany, and they felt that they needed some help. They wanted to help them both physically rebuild and economically rebuild. So the Allies got together, agreed to help them form new governments, give them money to rebuild. Remember, these nations, for a couple years had been under German control, so they needed new elected leaders to stabilize these nations. After they felt like this was they were on their feet, the Allies left. They said, "Okay, you're done. We're going to go back home. We're going to let you handle it on your own." The Eastern Bloc of Europe was a different story. Eastern Europe, as you can see in the political cartoon at the bottom, Soviet troops moved in under the direction of Joseph Stalin, and they never left. He basically went in and claimed them as, he called them satellite nations, and he set up his own political system known as communism. Both the Soviets and the Allies had different plans for helping rebuild after World War II. The United States developed what was known as the Marshall Plan, which gave economic recovery to different nations in Western Europe, and the Eastern Bloc was taken care of by Joseph Stalin with the Molotov Plan. So they had two of their own different strategies. And so the biggest thing here, the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as other nations, were allies during the World War II. However, they didn't have much in common, and that causes some problems post-World War II, especially when the United States uses this top secret weapon. And the Soviet Union's like, whoa, where'd that come from? You didn't share that with us. We went in on that. One of the biggest differences between these two nations was their style of government. The United States, as we know, has a democracy, and the Soviet Union had a communist government. Two different political styles, but they basically go against each other. With that, we had a growing sense of distrust between the two nations. Again, like I said, with the United States using the atomic bomb, not sharing that information with Russia was a huge red flag for them. Also, the ending of World War II was very different for the Soviets as opposed to the United States. The Soviet Union, a lot of its cities were destroyed because there was active fighting throughout different parts of Russia. They lost a lot of troops in the millions, whereas the United States, we were only impacted at Pearl Harbor, and we were only in the war for not as many years, and so we didn't lose as many people. So there's those problems as well. So these feelings or these tensions, they grew into what became known as the Cold War. And the Cold War is a war where it was just words, it was tension, it was threats. There was no actual physical fighting, so there's no weapons. So cold doesn't deal with the temperature, it deals with the threats. The idea that we're not using weapons. A hot war would have been World War II. Weapons were used. So we have that, we come out of World War II and go straight into the Cold War. So basically the nations that, if you see them here in red, they were no longer able to, speak for themselves or make their own laws, elect their own government officials. They were under Soviet control. Anything that was you see there in green, those are nations that, the United States and the Allies had helped. They were free to do what they like. Most citizens in the Soviet-controlled satellite nations were not allowed to travel beyond their borders, communicate with anyone outside. It was this stronghold where they kind of kept everybody in, kept everything very secret, because Joseph Stalin didn't want things getting out. And they basically say that this Iron Curtain was set up. The Iron Curtain was an imaginary wall. There was not a legit curtain, or there wasn't a legit iron wall. It was a term that basically described the closing off of the Soviet Union from the outside world. The British Prime Minister at the time, Winston Churchill, who had played a role in World War II as well, he's the one who uses this term. And again, it's an imaginary curtain, and it's shutting off the Western cultures, or it's shutting off the non-communist nations. So it separates communist from non-communist nations in Europe. As you can see in the diagram here, this little hand-drawn map, that thick black line, that's going to be your Iron Curtain. So it's separating nations like Yugoslavia, Austria, West Germany from East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, obviously the Soviet Union, and Poland. West Germany actually was divided into two sections. There was East and West Germany, and it took almost quite some time for Germany to be reunited, almost all the way into the 1980s. So that was a big deal. So we move back to the Nifty Fifties, as I said, talking about what life was like post-World War II. Most Americans in the 50s are valuing comfort and security over like adventure or like risky a lifestyle. The 1950s can be compared to the 1920s because it was very prosperous. We came out of a war. We were, victorious. So a lot of Americans don't want to get themselves into trouble like we did in the 1920s. So we're a little bit more cautious at this time. So again, we're enjoying a prosperous nation. The economy is finally back, recovered from the Great Depression. The troops came home from the war. So life is generally good. For one of the first times in like American history, the youth culture is able to be a kid for the first time. Kids don't have to work in factories to help support the family. They're able to actually go to school. They're able to do things that like normal teenagers and kids do. Go to the movies, go with their friends, go to the local, go to the sock hop, the dance at school. So life is just kind of good, and it's normal at this time for the general population. So we also have a giant, what becomes known as the baby boom. So the baby boom is the time period that begins in the mid 40s and continues into the the mid to late 50s. And as you can see from the diagram here, it's basically the time period mid-war to post-World War II, where troops came home and families are created. So anyone who anyone who was born between the 40s and the 50s, they are generally known as the baby boom generation. If you think about it today, if you call somebody a boomer, that's what they're referring to, people who were older, but a boomer would be someone who's born, like I said, right after World War II. And there are so many of them. This generation is one of the hugest generations we've ever had in American history, and it has huge implications for what's going to be happening soon, because this generation is retiring. This generation is unfortunately dying off, so there's going to be a huge gap in American citizens quite soon. So with the baby boom, we also have, they kind of go hand in hand, we have suburbia. So the GI Bill of Rights comes down, and basically returning soldiers, they give them access to low-income mortgages. It does other things too, like it helps them get an education. It helps them set themselves up after war, life after war. But one of the biggest part of it was this low-income mortgage, and it gave them the chance to move out of the cities and into suburbia. And we have a gentleman, William J. Levitt, who creates this idea of basically suburbia as we know it today. And entire communities are built relatively quickly based on using a mold and pre-assembled materials. So a mold meaning like the houses are identical on the inside, and they have these pre-assembled materials. The parts of the walls are assembled, and it's kind of like paint by numbers almost, but building a house. And so communities are able to pop up very, very quickly. So like you can see in the bottom left diagram, like if you're going to move into this neighborhood that's in the center, you can choose from one of these 4 houses. That's it. You can't like customize it. You can't do what you want. It's this 1, 2, 3, 4. So they become known as like cookie cutter houses. Like they're all exactly the same. And so some people say like they didn't like it because there's no variety. It's all the exact same house. Others loved it because you were in a house super quick. So it was just what you preferred. Cars and highways also become huge in the 1950s. So with the growth of suburbia, we need a way to get to our job. Moving out of the city, it's no longer walkable to a job, so we need the way to get there. Roads needed to be updated, cars needed to be produced, so Americans start relying more and more on cars. So again, because we needed better roads, in 1956, under the presidency of Eisenhower, we have the Federal Aid Highway Act, and it basically pours billions of dollars into creating the interstate system. So like I-95, that would be an interstate. An interstate is anything that connects states, any highway. So we have these major highways that are created in the 1950s, and cars become a huge part of American culture, and we start to build around that. So we have drive-in movies. We need a car to go to the drive-in. We have drive-in restaurants. Think kind of like Sonic, if you've ever been there. They were really big in the 1950s. People fall in love with their cars, and it just becomes a huge market and a huge piece of culture during this time period. The last thing to talk about today is how people started to challenge what becomes known as conformity. Basically, during this time period, there was kind of this mold that you were supposed to fit into, kind of a strictly defined role for the modern family, or for men and women. Men were expected to hold a job, support their family, be the breadwinner, go out and to work for a living. A lot of veterans who came home from World War II, sometimes they struggled finding jobs. Either things weren't there, they didn't have the skills. There's a lot of troops that went off to war straight out of high school, have no college education or no training in a vocation. And when they come back, they say, look, I didn't learn anything from World War II except for how to kill people. I don't know what you want me to do. So sometimes they struggled. Women were expected to perform domestic duties, take care of the house, take care of the children, be ready and willing and able to, help the husband, so on and so forth. But some women who got the taste of working during World War II wanted to continue working. So they're kind of challenging that, we're challenging conformity here, because we're telling men and women this is what you should be doing. But some of them are saying, I don't know, I want to go the other direction. And then we also have kids who are challenging conformity through the vehicle of rock and roll. This comes out during the 50s. It's a new style of music. It's very hip at the time. It's based on black rhythm and blues music. It's a little bit faster than jazz. It's upbeat. It's up tempo. It's just a good music. And it's very popular among teenagers, both black and white. And this challenges conformity, one, because the parents are like, oh my God, turn down that music. Parents always don't like their kids' music. But two, because it brought both black and white teenagers together, that's not really going to sit well with those who are pro-segregation at the time. They don't like the mixing of the races here. So as we'll see tomorrow in the next lesson, on the Civil Rights Movement, we'll talk more about segregation. But like I said, this is challenging your conformity there. So again, today we've been talking about the 1950s and how they were nifty. So please make sure you enter this into your interactive notebook on page 2. Thanks for watching.